Welcome to this video on test case design with Tricentis. When we first meet customers, we see an average of only 40% of the business risk being covered by existing tests. And in addition to this, we see around 67% of redundancies in these regression portfolios. This means we are spending a lot of time and resources running and maintaining tests that add no value. We see two main reasons for this. The first reason risk coverage stays so low is because when we start off testing, the business users and the SMEs can easily identify the most important test cases based on their knowledge and historical data. And these generally become their smoke tests. But after that, we see the regression suites start growing and growing in order to try to cover off the remaining areas of business risk, because there's no structured process in place to design these tests. This is where our customers, using our test case design, see an increase of business risk coverage to over 80% and a reduction in the number of test cases. So after we automate the existing smoke tests to see the immediate value of our model-based test automation, we then use our test case design to increase the business risk coverage and achieve over 90% of maintainable automation. The second reason we see risk coverage staying so low is when we depend on flowcharts to design our test case combinations. This is an easy way to map out all the possible paths to test, but it gives you little insight as to what data combinations and data dependencies are within each flow. So now the data design task gets handed over to a technical tester to script, sometimes in another tool. And the end test case results in poor traceability back to the process. This is because every test case has a different contribution to each process and the associated risk. This is why test case redundancies are so high and risk coverage is so low today. So let's have a look at a real example at one of our customers in the chemical industry. Let's pick just one transaction of their order to cash process. It mainly depends on the sales organizations, materials, customer and order types. If asked how to get full risk coverage here, you may say we need to combine all of these values or instances, as we call them, which would result in 2,100 test cases, and that's just for one transaction. And what about the rest of the process? If we continue to try to cover all combinations, we get an explosion of possible test combinations, and we don't have time or resources to cover all of these. With Tricentis, we apply a powerful but easy-to-use combination methodology. We identify and eliminate redundancies, which reduces the number of test cases, and we clearly see the test cases which contribute to the business risk. So from 2,100 tests, these are reduced to 33 tests, and we do the same across all the other transactions. And this can be applied across all technologies and all systems that make up the process. Tricentis uses a data-driven approach to designing test cases, where each block or instance represents a business rule with the data needed to test the system. This results in the minimum required data combinations. So here, test case 01 is our smoke test, or straight-through flow. We then divert from that flow by one instance when needed, in order to cover the remaining business rules, positive, negative, and boundary tests through the system paths. So there is no explosion of test cases being created. Every test has a unique focus and is weighted. There is traceable test coverage and a single point of maintenance. So let's have a look and see how this works. So Tricentis is a continuous testing platform that covers agile dev testing, automated continuous testing, and distributed load testing. But what we're going to do now is have a look and see how Tricentis's test case design can reduce the number of test cases and increase your business risk coverage. So what we're looking at now is my desktop, and I have Tricentis Tosca installed. And this is where we can use Tosca's test case design section to do our risk-based testing. So in today's example, we are going to stick with our insurance calculator, which is a web-based application where you select the actual vehicle type that you want to test. And as you click on that, you'll enter some data, and at the end you get an insurance quote. What we're going to focus on today is, if you click onto this tab here, there's some fields over here that relate to a date of birth, a gender, and a location, so the zip code. And this generates the system's premium at the end, or they all affect the business rules that help generate that quote that's sent out to our customers for that. So we want to do some testing around that and ensure there's no gaps and we have full business risk coverage for these particular fields here that will affect the quote from that side. So I'm going to collapse that now, and let's jump right into Tosca, and we can see here I've simplified my view just so we can focus on the risk-based testing today in our test case design. But in order to get our test case design started, we need to start off with our requirement section. So we'll have a quick overview on that, and then we'll jump into our test case design. This can be structured depending on how you're working, whether you're working in projects, releases, or sprints. However that is, we can set this up that relates to you, whether it's agile or waterfall projects. But I'm going to click on this one for today, collapse this one here. And what this does is, this gives me my project over here, and I've just named it with a release number, and it's representing my different requirements or processes or stories that I need to cover in my testing to ensure that all my business risk is covered. So what this is telling me at a snapshot level is that for this project, based on the last execution, 71% of the business risk is covered. And this is much more meaningful report than just pure based on large numbers of tests that run and pass and fail. This relates to real tangible value and business risk. So the way we create this and where we generate these reports is we have our requirements and we pull these in. So if you're using another tool like Jira or Quality Center or something like that, we can synchronize and pull this information in automatically using a connector into Tosca. And once we have your particular requirements with some information on what your business rules are, we can then start going through the process of weighting those processes. So we can do that using the frequency and the damage, or we can enter it right into the weighting. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but the end value is it really tells us where to focus our effort. So you can see here for this particular process or requirement, 62% of this is being contributed to the overall project. So everything else is a lot less valuable when it comes to business risk. This one has a lot of the business value tied in here. So we should focus on creating tests and covering this requirement before we cover the rest. If I open this up, one of the real values of Tricentis' test case design is we don't stop at the requirements level when it comes to weighting. We also weight the actual test cases. So what you'll see here is we have actual test cases linked. Some have passed, some have failed. But more importantly, they've all got weights linked to them over here from that side. So every time a test passes and it fails, each of them are weighted according to the business risk, and they also contribute to this report. And this is something really unique that Tricentis test case design does over anyone else, and adds a lot of value from that side. What we're going to do today is focus on this truck insurance requirement over here. And again, you can pull it in from another tool, but if you don't have synchronizations to other tools or you don't want to use them, you can also just pull it in from a Word document. You can see I have one over there, just so you can see an example. I'll open that up so you can have a look. There's a requirements documents that you might have. I'll scroll down to the end, and then maybe you have some business rules. Let's scroll down a little further. And there's the same information that I've synchronized, for example, from another tool. So this could be in a Word document. The main thing is to get that information into Tosca, whether you import it or synchronize it. And of course, you can also just create it yourself manually by doing a right click onto this little project level over here, and then creating a new requirement from that side. So by simply doing a right click, you can also just add a new requirement there and then fill in the information manually as well from that side. What I've also done here is, just to simplify it a bit further for today's example, is created just a picture that shows the same business rules. And we're going to come back to this a bit later because it's a bit easier to visualize. And what we're going to look at is we have an application, and let's say it's a new process for trucks. And these are some business rules around how we generate the premium for that. So we need to do some test case design to ensure we cover all the different combinations that meet the requirement, not just the parts, but also the data variants from that side. So I'll collapse that one for now. And what we're going to do is jump into our red section, which is our test case design section over here. And I'm going to right click, create a new folder, and we're going to work in this folder for now. So if I come back up here, let's say these are my business rules, and I want to generate some tests for that. And we're going to do this at a pure logical level for now. So the idea is I might be a business user. I want to make sure that the testers, whether they run it manually or whether it's automated, they're covering the right combinations to cover off this requirement. So based on whatever information you have, we can do that in this test case design section. So if we have a look at this, it says under 18s are not insured, and that's because they're too young. 18 to 23 have a premium surcharge, so it's increased by 20% because they're a bit more reckless. Over 59 of age, you get a reduction in premium, so they're a lot safer drivers. And women get a 5% discount as well from that side. If you live in the city, it get a 10% increase as well. So there's some basic, very generic business rules over here for this insurance calculator application. And I'll show you now how we can actually create the right data net variance to make sure that there's no redundant tests or duplicates. We make sure we have full traceability, that we've covered everything and mapped that back to a requirement when it comes to even converting that to an actual test case. So I'll jump to my new folder here. The first thing I'm going to do is create an empty spreadsheet. And there we have a test sheet. And now, again, based on the images here that we just had a look at, we're going to create different, what we call instances and attributes to cover off these business rules. So we can see here age is one, male and gender would be one, and the location, depending where they live. All of these will affect the premium. So if I come back to Tosca here, let's click on that. We're going to use the test case design tab. And we're basically going to say, I'm going to create a new object, which will be an attribute. Okay, so we're going to call it age. I can use shortcuts as well if I want over here. So NA, gender, back up to the top, and location. Okay, so very simple. All I've created is some attributes that relate to my business rules. Now for age, as we saw, we said there needs to make sure that people under 18 don't get insurance. So we need to test that range. We need to test the range of 18 to 23. And we need to test the range of 23 to 59. And then everyone over 59 gets the reduction in premium, so 59. Okay. We want to make sure that we test male and female, the gender. And then for the location, if you're in the city, you get a surcharge. And if you're in the countryside, we'll say it stays the same for this example. So now we've got all our different, what we're going to call instances, or maybe your business rules or different ranges that you need to test. And now we can go through and enrich it a bit further. So for example, that's a negative test. We can mark it as a negative test over there. So it goes to an X. If there's any others, we can simply mark them as that. And these will all come into play a little bit later. Another thing we do with our Tricentis is with our test case design, is we try to prioritize down to the lowest level as possible. This gives you a really more meaningful report when it comes to your risk coverage. So if we say over here, this is my highest range, there's a lot of value here, we can define what we call a straight through. So we saw that in the slide where we referred to smoke tests, but they could also be referred to as straight throughs. So the most commonly used value, every time you have a new build, this is the values you generally want to run through with your test. I can mark that as a red. And now it's basically saying that's the first thing we want to test. Same as with the genders, maybe based on historical data, we know there's more males coming through our insurance, so that's a bit more important for us. And for cities as well, we want to test it maybe for financial reasons. They have a higher surcharge, so we want to make sure we hit that test case first, because it'll be more loss to the company financially if that test doesn't work over others. And now what we do is we use Tosca's built-in algorithms to generate these tests. So we've got built-in combinations to say, for example, do I want that explosion of tests? Of course not, we don't. But we can selectively use that when we need it to. If you have two fields that are super important and you need to make sure every value is tested in two, we can actually selectively use the all combinations. So they are in there. They do have some value, but generally we would go for the linear expansion. If I click on that, what you're going to see is exactly what we saw in the slide. The straight through is all the reds that we've defined going through our flow for our application. And then after that, Tosca will divert by one value. So here we're doing a negative test for under 18s. Here we're testing that range. Here there's the range of over 59s. And then it's going to swap it out and say, here we're going to test females and country. So every test has its own unique focus The error analysis is a lot easier, and it's a full test coverage back to the actual requirement as to what this test is testing. So every test has its own unique focus. So that's a very high level. We can do this on a large scale end-to-end process, going page by page, and I'll go into a bit more detail now with that. So if I delete these, we can generate these at any time. We saw that we can also do boundary values. If you want to add boundary values, you can even say here, I have a new test. I want to make sure that we also test, for example, the age range 17, for example, over there. And again, you can mark it as a negative. Let's just click on that and mark that as a negative. And you can see I've changed it to the boundary. So you can change it to a boundary value, and we can mark it as a negative. So now it's got both in there. So same with here. If you wanted to create a new one, and make sure you test the 60 range. This is a positive test, so we can just say, select that one, and we're just going to make it a boundary test. So all of this can be represented in here, and you'll see this comes in a bit later when it comes to weighting. So you can go across all your applications and do that, your system from the beginning to the end, add in these business rules, and now Tosca will generate them for you and ensure that there's no gaps or no duplicates and redundant tests. Okay. So now we've done the same, and we've got some extra tests, a couple of negative tests here, and we've got an extra test there as well. Now what you can do is you've built up this little business logic. It's all on the logical level. There's no physical data yet. All you want to know is the tester going to cover the right combination of tests? And now we can enrich this further by saying, you know what, I'll delete that. There's some dependencies from one field to another. Or maybe there's one combination of tests that I want to make sure that gets covered. We have this relation tab for that. So if I click on that, you have the option to add dependencies in here. And if I open this up, you'll see required, forbidden, constrained. So what we can say is, as an example, to keep it simple, we're going to say is, I want an extra test case. Tosca is going to use the linear expansion to generate the others, but I want an extra test case, and Tosca must ensure that, for example, let's come over here and say, I want to make sure that within this age range, we also check that males there's a test case that covers them in the countryside. Because we have a lot of young people getting cars, souping them up with the engines, and then they get a bit reckless. So now we want to make sure that we cover, there's a test case that hits this particular group from that side. And you can put in some more information here on why you added that relation from that level. And you can come back over here. And what now Tosca does is you can do a right click. And we've put it in this menu here because you need to make sure you set up these relations. So if I click on that now, what you'll see is we've got all our test cases like before. They all have their unique focus, but we have an extra test here that covers that range over here for males in the countries. It might be a little bit reckless with driving. And you can rename it as well. You can say, these are my high. This is going to be a high risk scenario. And I'll label it as that. Okay. So really, this is what we have our business guys doing. This is all they need to really do at this point. If they want to, we can actually start adding, go a bit one level further and add even error messages to it. It's up to you, or you leave that for the testing team later, but just to show you how easy it is, let's say you wanted to verify error messages. I can even say now, based on this data we've entered here, I expect an error message to display, and you can already say true or false. And what we've got here in Tosca, again, is I click on this here, and let me just change the character, the business relevance, and now we can change it to a green. So these were all used to generate the actual number of tests, but if this isn't, you don't want a specific test that just tests this, but it needs to be linked to some existing values, we can mark it as a green, and it's more for the verification checks we want to do. So whether it's a positive verification or negative, we can add these in here as well. So what I'm doing now is I'm mapping these error messages here and saying when this is entered and when that's entered, we expect an error message to be displayed. I might not know what it is yet, but logically I can say there's an error message there. I want the testers to cover this when they create their tests, whether it's manual or automated. And that's it from that side. This is all we expect the business users to do on this level. Set up the logical values that they want to cover that meets the test. Then what we see a lot is depending on how your company is structured. If you have small teams, they might move on and do the automation as well. In larger teams where it's more structured, they might say, I've done this section. I've ensured that these different business rules are covered and the right error messages are displayed or checks are made, and now I can hand it over to another team to do the actual automation. The great thing is it's all in one tool. We're not merging or integrating with other tools and losing anything along the way when it comes to reporting or mapping back to the requirement. And we'll see here why. So what we can do now is, if I collapse all of these, one thing we can do is we can say, okay, these are all the tests I want generated. I want to now link it to my requirement here. So this is the one we were looking at before. So I want to tell Tosca, based on these data sheets that I already created, link it to that. So now you can see it automatically linked that sheet with all the possible business rules that I want covered in my testing to that particular requirement here. And what you'll see here is these are weighted, but these are all defaulted to 1. So now what the business user can do, if they want to go even one level further, I can say column chooser, come down here, and we're going to pull in the weight, and we're going to put in the relative weight. Sorry, we're going to put in the instance usage over here. So what are these? What did I bring these two in for? And these are for, when I mentioned before, is we can make sure there's no redundant test cases or make sure there's no gaps. This is the gaps we're talking about. So what you'll see here is based on all the values you've entered here for this data sheet here, and all of these will become an individual test case, whether you use a manual or automated approach later, these will be an individual test. It's telling me, have I covered all my different values or business rules in a test somewhere? So here it's saying I have 100% coverage of all the values, but just so you can see if I had to change one, and let's say I removed 18 to nothing, click on that, you can see it changes there, it goes bold, so it gives you that visual straight away that you have a gap in your testing when it relates to your actual business rules. So I'll add that back over here, and then it'll change back. So that's my instance usage, very important for identifying gaps. The other one is the weight over here. So what we can do is we can actually weight your actual business rules to the lowest level, or you could just keep it on the test case level here. So these are all the ones we saw in the requirement section, and you can come through here and weight and say this is a smoke test or a strength to, it's more important than the others. Or if you want, you can even use Tosca to say auto assign weights. And these are the positives and negatives.
Assigned, it's going to be weightings on that side. But again, this is really showing you when these test cases fail later in an execution, it's going to relate back to the requirement and give you that exact business coverage, the true business coverage for that process. So if I come over here and just tell Tosca to update weights, you can see it's pulled all of them across. So now if this test case fails, it's going to relate, impact this report a lot higher than if one of these ones did over here, for example. And this one had no weighting, so I can always go there here and manually just put in, this is a high risk one. Let's say I wanted to weigh as well, 300. Enter that in there. Come back over here, tell Tosca update weight, and now we have a 300. So these are my two important ones that will come to the weights from that side. And that's really the business risk coverage and how we do that. The great thing now is with Tosca is once the business users are finished, what they can do is they can say, okay, these are my business rules. I want the tester to now create these. I'm going to drop these. We don't need this column anymore. I can actually tell Tosca right click and convert this into a class. Okay. If I do that, what you'll see now is it's created a class, and I can actually delete this test sheet. And the reason why is now you can say I've already gone through here and I've created all the business rules and dependencies using a number of ways. Could be manual, could be using the relations, but this is the values that I want to test against. So you can say, for example, these are my business rules for insurance for your particular process that you want, and name however you like. And now this can be reused over and over by a tester. So now all the tester's doing is they come along and they say, for example, I'm going to create a new test sheet. Now this is a class, basically. It's like a little library of business rules that we can create, and they're maintained in one place, and they can be reused over and over in different test sheets. So if you're testing this via a UI or via a number of different web-based UI applications, so you could access it via a web, via a desktop, via an API, you can use this to drive all your automation, and it's all centrally managed. So I can drag and drop that, and what you'll see here is, it's just a reference to that class or that business rule. And then if I come over here, I can say, okay, these are my business rules for insurance for your particular process that you want, and name however you like. And now this can be reused over and over by a tester. So now all the tester's doing is they come along and they say, for example, I'm going to create a new test sheet. Now this is a class, basically. It's like a little library of business rules that we can create, and they're maintained in one place, and they can be reused over and over in different test sheets. So if you're testing this via a UI or via a number of different web-based applications, so you could access it via a web, via a desktop, via an API, you can use this to drive all your automation, and it's all centrally managed. So I can drag and drop that, and what you'll see here is, it's just a reference to that
that we've set up. And now again, we can say to tell Tosca to generate some data combinations based on linear expansion, and I'll have all my tests based on that. Okay, so now what the tester can do is they can go a bit further. So we've looked at all the values on a logical level, and we've made sure we've covered our business rules. Now we want to say, what is the physical data we need to assign to these particular values here? Because I can't link up that to a manual or an automated test. I need to have an actual value to enter. So age range is a great example. Male might be the same, so we don't need a physical value. City, we might need to assign one to it, but the way we would do that is, let me just delete these for now. I'll jump back to my class here. I'll double click on age, and I can come in here and just say right click, and let's say, oops, let's undo that. Right click, and we're going to assign a value. So I can say, for example, I want to assign a value. So of course you can add a hard-coded date in here that says, for example, this is the date that relates to a 17-year-old, but we want to enter a dynamic date. So I'm going to take it from another example, but basically you can come into Tosca and say, we have a number of dynamic and regular expressions. So based on today's date, you can actually say add 3 months minus 1 day, and then specify the format over here. So all of this can be added to these particular values over here. And that way, when you actually translate it to an actual test case, when you hook it up to an actual physical test, Tosca will then look at this value and enter that in the test and not this one. But this is what we use to actually determine the number of tests and to ensure that we've covered the business rule. And this would be the value that is actually linked to the actual test case in the end. And we can obviously change that, and we can do a number of different variations of data here to make sure that we cover the right business rule. Okay. So what I've done is I've set that up already, so we're not going to create it again. But if you can have a look here, insurance details, exact same one we just looked at. But what I've done now is if I expand that, you'll see, let me expand all. You can see for this date range, I've actually said generate a date using random numbers between the range of 29 and 59. And whatever comes back, it's going to minus that in years from today's date. So that way it's always going to generate a date of birth in the correct format that the system needs, using random numbers, but in that range. So sticking with that business rule, which is very important. Here it's going to make sure it's always, for example, 17-year-old that we want to test. Here it's in the range of 18 to 23, and so forth, going through all the different variations. So you can assign these physical values to these, and they can be a part of this. In this case, it's a little class or library, but it's the same place. This is what's determining the actual test cases and the number of tests, and then the physical value will actually be generated and linked to the actual test case itself. So the end result here is a tester would come in and say, I need to automate that test. Here's my test sheet. I've already set it up. So here's my different library. And what you'll see here is you can generate these in a number of ways. Let's say these have no business relevance to it at all. You just want to randomize them. You can do some random values here. Choose between a range of Ford, BMW, Honda, and Toyota for my make. Randomly generate a number for here. Here's a generated data manufacturer. Choose between a range for seats. So all of this is available here. We don't expect the business users to do this. This is more the testing side. The business users would be actually creating the logical data variants that need to be covered for my requirement itself. So I'll go through a few just so you can see an example. That's the automobile. You can, of course, just hard code values in as well if you didn't want to randomize them. But one thing that's important here is also how you actually verify values. So at the end, we're going to have an insurance calculator that's going to generate a premium and a quote. I can actually say at runtime, I want to verify that some calculation is applied and it equals the premium displayed on the screen. That can be added in there. You can verify that a specific format is met based on the amount that's returned. You can also go do a database query and pull a value from a database and compare it to what's on the UI, for example, as well. So all of that's available here. And this is more on the test case side, assigning physical values to your test. And there's a hard-coded value there. But what I'm going to do is grab a few of them, insurance, automobile, and there's my verifications. So I can drag these, put them in my test. All the hard work's been done in the actual library itself over here. But now I can tell Tosca simply come over here and generate my instances. I'll stick with linear expansion. And now you'll see it's going to go through one screen that says automobile. Go through the insurance, enter all the data correctly for the actual values, and you can see all the dates and makes, and then right at the end, it's going to do my verifications over here from the side. Okay. And I'll just set it up to use the same one over and over again. But this is really the value here that we see with Tricentis' test case design, because if you click on that, for example, here, if someone goes and adds duplicate tests, we can actually merge duplicates together. It shows you the actual gaps in your actual test cases. So if you've added values here that aren't covered, we saw that we can see the actual gaps that are pointed out by using that instance coverage column as well, and as well as the weights as well that can be applied. So once you've done your logical values, you've added your physical values to the actual data, then we move over to our test case section, and we have our model-based test automation. And I'll expand that. We're not covering this today, but just so you can see, this is what a test case looks like. We're opening a URL, entering some data, navigating around, and when it comes to the data-driven piece, this is going to get pulled from the red section, because these are what's driving my business rules. And in this case, I left some data hard-coded in the test, but these are the important ones that are going to drive the business rules, so I'll pull them out, and that's going to be mapped from my test sheet. So if I come over here, all I need to do now is grab my test sheet, associate it to my template. I don't need any of these anymore. And then now Tosca can merge my data sheets together with my template and generate tests. So in this case, there was only 5. To go back to here just to refresh our memories, there was only 5 instances on this one I dragged and dropped. So there's 5 test cases. So if I come over here, we have 5 test cases linked. Here's my straight through, and I can open that up, and now we will see the physical values pulled in from the spreadsheet. So I've got some randomized calculations being done in this case. And when we get over here, here's my date range, but sticking with my business rules, the physical value that Tosca needs to use to automate. But you could also run this manually, and then it'll generate that date for you in your manual executor, and you can input that as well. So you can see there's the male and female, and there's the random number for the zip code that relates to the city that we can assign. And right at the end here, you can see we did some verifications in a table for the premium. It pulled all the values through as well for those. And an extra one I added in here is the actual SQL querying. If you want to run a database query and pull a value from a database and then compare it with what's on the screen, we saw here, if I jump back here, and let's jump to my sheet. You can see at the bottom here, one of them is going to actually run a query and pull some query from a database. There's my query. That can be actually linked to my template as well. And that's what Tosca is going to do here. It's going to run the query using a model-based approach. It's going to save the value that comes back to a variable name from the database, and then you compare that value against the screen from there. So there's my variable name. It saved the value from the database and compared it to the screen. So just to summarize that, really what the takeaway should be here is we can start off by creating very simply, ensuring that our business logic is covered down to low level, remove any redundant or duplicates, identify any gaps. These get mapped back to your requirements, and this is what gives you that risk coverage. When these test cases run and they pass and they fail, it'll relate back to this report we see over here. And this is how we really end up reducing the number of tests and increasing the business risk coverage for our customers. So thanks for your time, and I hope that demo was useful to you.